We are going to deal with inorganic qualitative analysis in this video. Inorganic qualitative analysis is an inorganic analytical technique It is an inorganic analytical technique in which we are provided a sample and we identify the constituents of the sample. So in this technique, our aim is to find out the constituent of the sample. Say for example, if the sample is blue vitriol, after performing qualitative analysis on our sample, we'll come to the conclusion that the constituent of blue vitriol are cupric ion, sulfate ion and water molecules. Now, depending on the amount of the sample that is available for analysis, this inorganic qualitative analytical technique is divided into 5 different types. The very first is macro analytical technique. We categorize it as a macro analytical technique if the amount of sample that is available for analysis is in the range of 0.5 to 1 gram. If it is in a solution form, if sample is in a solution form, then sample amount is in the range of 20 to 30 ml. The technique will be called as semi-micro analytical technique. If the amount of sample is in the range of 0.05 to 0.1 gram. If it is in a solution form, the amount of sample must be at least 10 ml. If the amount of sample is less than that, we call it as micro analysis or micro analytical technique. Herein the amount of sample is in the range of 0.01 gram to 0.05 gram, and if it is in a solution form, solution at least be 1 ml. When the amount of sample is below that, we say the technique as ultra micro analysis or ultra micro analytical technique, and the amount of sample in this is about 1 milligram. If the amount of sample is below that, that is less than 1 milligram, we call the technique as analytical technique as tracer analytical technique. In this, the amount of sample is less than 1 milligram. So as far as these techniques are concerned, these 3 techniques, microanalysis, tracer analysis and ultra microanalysis, all these are instrumental technique. So these are sophisticated technique, whereas these 2 techniques, macro and semi-micro analytical techniques, are wet chemistry techniques. That is, these are essentially non-instrumental technique. Which is of our interest for now, for this video. In that also, when we talk about macro analysis, we can see that the amount of sample is too large, 0.5 to 1 gram. This is something not good as far as environmental aspect is concerned. If we are using such a large amount of sample and draining every chemical in a drain, this will lead to damage to our environment. So this is not a greener approach, and a good chemist always try to use chemicals in least possible amounts. So macro analysis is something that we are not going to talk about, and many of the good chemists have already abandoned macro analytical chemical technique. So we are going to focus on wet chemistry, and for that we are going to adapt a greener approach, semi-micro analysis. At least it is relatively greener to macro analytical technique, where the amount of sample is 0.05 to 0.1 gram, or if it is in a solution form, the sample must be at least 10 ml. One may think that when we already have instrumental technique, why should we learn semi-micro qualitative analysis? It is because semi-micro deals with wet chemistry. It deals with identifying the inorganic compound by carrying chemical reactions on the sample. And if we are performing chemical reactions on our sample, we'll understand the aspects of chemical reaction, which is the main goal of any chemist, to understand how the chemical reactions occur, what are the conditions that are necessary to be taken into consideration for any chemical reactions to be performed in a safer manner. So as far as semi-micro analysis is concerned, it is very much important in academic world, because it helps a chemist to understand chemical reaction, it helps to visualize the chemical reaction, and also to perform in a lab. So we are going to focus on semi-micro qualitative analysis. So now we are going to see semi-micro qualitative analysis, but before we go to the semi-micro analytical technique, to understand, we must talk something very much important about safety measures. Safety measures tells you what are the safety measures that one must take as a chemist into consideration when he or she is working in a lab. The very first is never work alone. You must never work alone in a chemistry lab. Next is always wear apron, and your apron should be essentially a cotton apron, plus all the buttons of your apron must be tucked all the time. Third is wear safety goggles or safety glasses all the time in the lab. Next is wear shoes. Don't wear sandal or a chappal, because if at all any chemical spillage occur by accident, you will not be saved if you are with sandal or a chappal. So wear shoes. This is again one more important safety measure that one must take, but many of them keep this aside, this safety measure. If your hair are long, you must tie your hair properly. Sixth safety measure one must follow is do not experiment anything new by yourself. Because chemistry lab is always a potent danger. All the experiments that are instructed by your teacher or professor, only those experiments must be performed in the lab. Never try something new in the lab. This may lead to danger to yourself and to your associate friends who are working with you. All those who follow these instructions in the lab strictly are good chemists. So if you are following this instruction all the time in the lab, then you are essentially a good chemist. And if you do not follow these instructions in the lab, then it is immaterial whether or not you are coming with the good results after performing experiments in the lab. You will not be called as good chemists. So it is very much important that you follow these safety measures in the lab all the time. Now, with the pledge that we'll follow the safety measures in the lab, let us begin with the understanding of semi-micro qualitative analysis. We know that this is an inorganic analytical technique, and we call it as semi-micro when the amount of sample that is available for analysis is in the range of 0.05 gram to 0.1 gram. And we know sample is a mixture of two salts and so it is a mixture of two salts. Now we'll try to see what is the general principle on which semi-micro qualitative analysis works. Because we are dealing with salts, we know that salts are strong electrolytes. What are strong electrolytes? Strong electrolytes are those ionic compounds which dissociates almost completely, and we can presume that their dissociation practically is 100%. When dissolved in suitable solvent, and generally the solvent used is water, or in some cases we acidify the water so that the electrolyte goes into solution almost completely. So general principle on which semi-micro is based is we make our mixture constituents to go into solution in the form of ions. And once the constituent of our mixture, of our sample, goes into ions, then we perform characteristic test on ions, which may be either a color change, or it may be a formation of precipitate, or it may be evolution of some gases which may be further analyzed. So this is the general idea on which semi-micro is based. The mixture of salt is made to dissociate completely in a suitable solvent, and once the ions are available, we perform characteristic chemical analysis on those ions, such in the way that we get at least a typical color change or a precipitate formation or evolution of gas, which eventually allows us to know what are the ions we are dealing with, that is the constituent of the two salts. Qualitative analysis is systematically divided into different steps. So steps involved in semi-micro. Analysis. The very first step is preliminary test. Preliminary test first is further subdivided into physical examination, this test is only a general test, will give us a general idea what constituent may be present in the given sample. Physical examination involves two different investigations. One is color and another is odor. So we physically investigate the color of the sample, and depending on the color, once we identify a color of the sample, we may come to some inference. If the color of the sample is blue, our inference is cupric or cobalt 2 plus ion is present. If it is cobalt 2 plus, the blue color is a dark blue color. If the sample is green in color, our inference is a sample may contain cupric, Ni2 plus, Fe2 plus. If it is Fe2 plus, the green color is light green color, or it may be chromium 3 plus ion. And if it is chromium 3 plus, the green color is very dark green color. If the sample is yellow, the ions that may be dealing with in the sample is ferric ions, or it may be chromate ion. This chromate ion is generally not given because it is strong oxidizing agent. If the sample is brown, then it is very much possible that the sample contains ferric ion. If the sample is pink, then our inference is sample may contain cobalt 2 plus ion. We can see that we have cobalt which can exhibit blue color, cobalt which can exhibit even a pink color. If it is pink color, then it is hydrated. Hydrated means it is having complexed water molecule around it. It can be Mn2 plus. If it is Mn2 plus, the pink color has to be very light, very pale pink. If the color of the sample is orange, our inference is that the compound may contain dichromate ion. Again, being strong oxidizing agent is generally avoided. If the sample is white, it contains that, it suggests that the constituent present in the sample are main group cations or 3D10 metal ions. 3D10 metal ions means zinc or cadmium or mercury. Physical examination that we do is the odor of the sample. This is generally not suggested to perform because investigating odors of a compound is expected to be dangerous to health. So, but this is one of the old way by which semi-micro-qualitative analysis was performed by chemists. So, because of its academic interest, I will also discuss how to identify the odor. In this, a pinch of sample is moistened with a drop of distilled water and rubbed between the fingers and detected for any typical odor. So in this particular technique, we simply take a sample in a pinch and then we add a drop of water in it, and then we rub it and we try to detect the odor. we see if we are getting any typical odor of the sample. Depending on the odor that we identify, we may come to some conclusion or inference. So odor and inference. If the odor is ammonical odor, our inference is ammonium ion may be present. If the odor is rotten egg, our inference is sulfide ion may be present. So this is sulfide. If the odor is vinegar odor, vinegar like odor, you might be familiar with the vinegar odor. The ion is acetate ion. If the odor is burning sulfur odor, our inference is sulfite ion may be present. This is sulfite. Many learners make a confusion between sulfide and sulfite. This is sulfide and this is sulfite. This is IDE and this is ITE. So after physical examination, which comes under preliminary test, the another preliminary test is heating in a dry test tube. In this, a small amount of sample is taken in a dry borosilicate test tube and heated using Bunsen burner. We observe for any gas evolution or any color change. This test must be performed strictly in a dry condition. Dry means there must not be any moisture or water present in a test tube, because if there is water, the salt under investigation may suffer hydrolysis and we may get some results that may not coincident with our expected outcomes. In this, we are observing either a gas evolution or a color change. As far as gas evolution is concerned, if we identified what is the gas that is evolved, we may come some inference. If the gas evolved is carbon dioxide, our inference is carbonate ion, bicarbonate ion, or oxalate ion may be present. And how do we know whether the gas evolved during this heating is a carbon dioxide? It turns freshly prepared lime water milky. So if a freshly prepared lime water is turning milky by the gas that is evolved from the test tube, then we say the gas evolved is either carbon dioxide, and our inference is carbonate, bicarbonate, or oxalate may be present in the sample. If the gas evolved is sulfur dioxide, our inference is that the sample may contain sulfite ion or thiosulfate ion. Sulfite ion or thiosulfate ion. How do we know that the gas is sulfur dioxide gas? This gas turns moist, acidified, dichromate paper green. So this sulfur dioxide, if the gas is sulfur dioxide, it turns moist acidified K2Cr2O7 paper green. Acid used in this must be sulfuric acid strictly. It can't be nitric acid or HCl. If the gas evolved is H2S, our inference is sulfide may be present. And how do we know that the gas is sulfide ion? It turns moist lead acetate paper black. So if the gas evolved is turning moist lead acetate paper black, we say that the gas is H2S and inference is sulfide may be present. If the gas evolved is HCl, our inference is chloride may be present. How do we know that the gas is HCl? It will turn moist blue litmus red. So chloride may be present. If the gas evolved is nitrogen dioxide, which is a reddish brown gas, our inference is nitrate or nitrite may be present. So this is nitrate and this is nitrite. Again here this is nitrate ATE and this is nitrite ITE. How do we know that the gas is nitrogen dioxide? This gas turns aqueous ferrous sulfate solution black. So if the gas is turning ferrous sulfate solution black, we say the gas is nitrogen dioxide, and we may come to the inference that the constituent present in the sample may be nitrite or nitrite. If the gas evolved is having a vinegar odor, our inference is acetate ion may be present. If the gas evolved have an ammonical odor, our inference is ammonium ion may be present. And how do we know that the gas is giving ammonical odor? We have typical odor for ammonia. You all must be familiar with the odor of ammonia. Plus it will turn moist red litmus blue. It is obvious because ammonia is a base, so it will turn red litmus blue. If the gas evolved is brown gas, this is again a reddish brown gas, our inference is bromide may be present. So we have two gases which are brown gas. This is also reddish brown gas. This is also a reddish brown gas. And how do we know which is nitrogen dioxide and which is bromine? Bromine gas turns moist starch iodide paper blue. So if moist starch iodide paper is turning blue, it is bromine gas. And if aqueous FeSO4 solution is turning black, it is nitrogen dioxide gas. If the gas is bromine, our inference is bromide may be present. If the gas is chlorine gas, chlorine is a greenish yellow gas. Our inference will be chloride may be present. And how do we know it is chlorine gas? It turns moist blue litmus red, and if we continue to keep the paper in contact with the gas Finally, the paper bleaches. So if a moist blue litmus is turning red and eventually bleaches, we say that the gas is chlorine gas. This bleaching action is because of the strong oxidizing nature of chlorine gas. So the gas evolved will be chlorine if it turns blue litmus to red and the paper eventually bleaches. The gas evolved is iodine gas. We are familiar with the color of iodine gas, it is violet color. So this will give a violet color and it itself suggests that it is iodine. So our inference is iodide may be present. And if the sample that is heated in a dry test tube sublimes and condenses on the colder part of the test tube, so if the mixture is subliming and condensing on the colder part of the test tube, we say ammonium may be present. Another thing that we investigate during the dry test, that is heating in a dry test, is color of the residue. So depending on the color of the residue, we may come with some inference. Herein we investigate the color of the residue in two different conditions: when hot and when it is cooled down to room temperature. So if the color of the residue is yellow when hot and turns white when it attains the room temperature, our inference is Zn2 plus ions may be present in the sample. If the color of the residue is brown and turns yellow on cooling, our inference is Pb2 plus ions may be present in the sample. If the color of the residue when hot is brown and remains brown even on cooling, our inference is cadmium ions may be present. If the color of the residue when hot is reddish brown and remains reddish brown, it suggests that the sample may contain ferric or ferrous ions. If the sample is if the residue is black when hot and black when cold, our inference is it may be nickel ion, it may be cobaltous ion, it may be Mn2 plus ion, or it may be cupric ion, If the color of the residue is bluish when hot and remains bluish even on cooling, our inference is cupric ion may be present. If the color of the residue is green when hot and remains green even on cooling, our inference is Ni2 plus ion may be present. So another preliminary test that we perform after heating in a dry tube is charcoal cavity test. In charcoal cavity test, a charcoal is taken and a cavity is made in it, by using pair of tongs and in that cavity a sample small amount of sample is fused with fusion mixture. What is fusion mixture? Fusion mixture is a mixture of solid sodium carbonate and solid potassium carbonate. We fuse the mixture in a reducing flame. That is luminous flame. It is essential that we carry out this reaction in a reducing flame because we want a reducing atmosphere for this reaction to go in a right direction. So we perform this experiment and observe for the following. We look at the residue and check for the color of the residue in hot and cold condition. So residue color in hot and cold means when it attains the room temperature, and then our inference if the residue is yellow when hot and turns white when attains the room temperature, our inference is Zn2 plus may be present. If the residue is reddish brown and remains reddish brown even on cooling, our inference is cadmium 2 plus may be present. If our residue is reddish brown and on cooling, if it turns yellow, our inference is lead may be present. If the residue is orange and on cooling turns yellow, our inference is bismuth ion may be present. If the residue is red and remains red even on cooling, our inference is cupric ion may be present. If our residue is shiny white and remains shiny white, our inference is silver ion may be present. Generally silver ion is not given because of economical reasons. Silver salts are very costly, so it is generally not given. If the residue is grayish white and remains grayish white, then we say antimony may be present. Now if our residue is white when hot and remains white even on cooling, then we perform another test. We call it as cobalt nitrate test. So this test is again a test that is coming under charcoal cavity test, but it is to be performed only when your residue is white when hot and remains white even when residue becomes cool. What do we do is, to the residue in a charcoal cavity, we add a drop of aqueous cobalt nitrate. We add a drop of cobalt nitrate solution, and now heat the residue in an oxidizing flame. So it is to be noted that here we require oxidizing atmosphere for our reaction to take up right direction, that is non-luminous flame. Again we look for the color of the residue. Now we'll look for the color of the residue. And we may arrive at some inference. So if the color of the residue is green, our inference is Zn2 plus may be present. If the color of the residue is pink, our inference is Mg2 plus may be present. If the color of the residue is dirty bluish green, then we say tin may be present. If the color of the residue is blue, our inference is borate, phosphate, or aluminum ion may be present. So now before proceeding ahead, let us see some chemistry behind charcoal cavity test. So we'll try to understand some chemistry behind charcoal cavity test. Our goal of charcoal cavity test is to convert our metal salt. We know we are dealing with a salt mixture as a sample. That is, we are dealing with two metal cations. And our goal is to convert these metal cations into their metal oxides, or in some cases into their elemental metal form. Because metal oxides have typical colors, if we are performing this test after the formation of a metal oxide, it will give a typical color. Consequently, it will help us to know what metal cations we are dealing with. On the other hand, if it converts into elemental form conversion is possible because we are using charcoal. Charcoal is a charcoal is a carbon, and carbon is a strong reducing agent at high temperature. So the reduction strength of carbon may force the metal oxide to reduce into the elemental metal form in some cases, not in all the cases. So again, elemental metal form have typical colors, and this helps some of the metal have typical color in their elemental form. And so again, we may come to some inference what metal we are dealing with in this. Okay. What are we doing in charcoal cavity test? We are taking a mixture, that is our sample, and then we are adding double the quantity of fusion mixture. And what is fusion mixture? Fusion mixture is a mixture of solid sodium carbonate and solid potassium carbonate. What is the job of this fusion mixture? Why are we doing that? When we add fusion mixture, the metal cations in the sample gets converted into metal carbonates. So metal cation that we have, when fused with sodium carbonate, it forms metal carbonates. Why we are converting it to metal carbonate? Why are we not converting metal cation directly into its oxide? Why this direct conversion is not done? Because metal carbonates are generally thermally unstable and decomposes easily to their respective metal oxides. So carbonates are generally unstable to heat. So say for example, if I have a calcium carbonate, if I am heating calcium carbonate, what we get is calcium oxide and carbon dioxide is given off. So we end up with metal oxide. If we try to perform the reaction in absence of fusion mixture, the reaction will take large time. Carbon can also do that, but it will take large time. So what we do is we take alternative step wherein mixture first reacts with the fusion mixture. Our sample reacts with the fusion mixture, gets converted to metal carbonate, which is very easy to decompose at high temperature, and our goal is achieved in a short time. So this is the reason why we are performing charcoal cavity test. Another question that arises in our mind is, why are we using reducing flame? Why reducing flame? Again, this question arises in our mind. There are two reasons for this. We have, by using charcoal, we have created a reducing condition. And by using reducing flame, we are ensuring that the condition is not disturbed. We know our flame is also reducing flame. Reducing flame have carbon particles, so it is again have a capacity to carry out reduction reaction. So first of the reason is we want reducing atmosphere, so we are using reducing flame. Another reason is reducing flame temperature is lower than oxidizing flame. Reducing flame temperature is lower than oxidizing flame. Why we are doing that? Because we want our temperature to be high, but not so much high, because if the temperature is very high, we know that charcoal is a very strong carbon is a very strong reducing agent at high temperature. If temperature is very much high, all the metal cations will reduce into their elemental form. In fact, we want metal to convert into metal oxides. So if I am carrying out the reaction at very high temperature, that is by using oxidizing flame, then all the metal cations will turn into elemental form, and I may not get a metal oxide which I am interested in, which are going to give us a typical color and helping us to know what metal cations we are dealing with. So this is the reason why we are performing charcoal cavity test, the role of fusion mixture, and why are we using reducing flame. There are two reasons why we are using reducing flame. One is we want reducing atmosphere, and second is because reducing flame have low temperature, it ensures that the very strong reducing agent carbon do not reduces metal cation directly into their elemental form, stops the reaction at metal oxide. And what is the chemistry behind cobalt nitrate test? What do we do in this? When our residue in charcoal cavity remains white, what do we do is we add a drop of cobalt nitrate to the residue and heat it in an oxidizing flame. What happens in this is cobalt nitrate in an oxidizing flame, when heated, forms a cobalt oxide, and the residue which have our metal cation of a sample gets converted into metal oxide. So eventually it results in the formation of double oxide, which have typical color, again allowing us to know what cations we are dealing with. So now let us move to another preliminary test. Another preliminary test that we perform is flame test. This is one of the important preliminary tests in which we get very valuable information regarding the sample we are dealing with. Flame test is a spectroscopic technique. This is the spectroscopic method developed by Robert Bunsen and Kirchhoff. We know that some salts, when heated in a flame, oxidizing flame, they give typical color. So what do we do in this test is, we take a mixture in a watch glass and add very small amount, say 1 or 2 drops of concentrated HCl to it, so as to form a paste. This paste is taken on platinum wire loop and then heated on a Bunsen burner in an oxidizing flame. And is observed for any color. So we observe for flame color, from which we may come to some inference. If the flame color is bluish green, our inference is CO2 plus ions present. If the flame color is grassy green, or we can say apple green, our inference is barium may be present. If the flame color is crimson red, our inference becomes strontium may be present. If the color of the flame is brick red, our inference is calcium ion may be present. If the flame color is violet, our inference is potassium ion is present. And if the flame color is golden color, golden yellow, we say that the cation we are dealing with is Na plus ions. This test is very reliable test. So if we can identify any one of the color in a very right manner, we may conclude what cations we are dealing with. So this is one of the very sensitive tests. Now let us try to understand some chemistry behind the flame test. Chemistry behind the flame test. We'll take an example of sodium. If we are dealing with a mixture that is containing sodium ion, we know the atomic number of sodium is 11. So its electronic configuration is 1s2, 2s2, 2p6, 3s1. So when salt is heated in a sample, in a Bunsen burner, so when we are heating a salt on a loop in a Bunsen burner flame, it gives golden yellow color. What is the mechanism of this golden yellow color if we are dealing with Na plus ion, sodium Na plus ion? Okay, as heat is a source of energy, we are heating it. Heat is a source of energy. This is the ground state electronic configuration. Of sodium atom. So when we are talking about valence electron, we say it is in a ground state when it is occupying a 3s orbital. So I can depict a ground state as 3s, and above that next is 3p. So this is 3p, and our electron in ground state is in 3s orbital. So this is ground state. This is ground state. When we heat the sodium sample, we are providing energy, and exactly this much amount of energy is absorbed from the heat by the electron, and electron gets excited. So now electron is in 3p orbital. We call it as absorption of energy, and this is an excited state. This excited state being unstable will not last for long. Immediately this electron will come back and will give out the energy that is absorbed back as a photon. So the electron will come back to ground state with the emission of photon, which is golden yellow color, giving a golden yellow color to our flame. So what is the mechanism happening in this reaction is, any salt that is sensitive to flame test, when heated in a flame, its ground state electronic configuration, say in sodium it is 3s1, its ground state gets converted to the excited state by absorbing a definite amount of energy, and because excited state is an unstable state, this electron gets back to the ground state, and while doing that, so it emits the photon that matches with the amount of energy that was absorbed during the excitation. And if this photon emitted have a typical color, it will give a typical color to the light, to the flame, allowing us to know what metal cations we are dealing with. One question that may arise in our mind is, we are not dealing with the metallic sodium in our salt. Your salt mixture is not metallic sodium. Your salt mixture is metal cation, that is Na+. So what will be the electronic configuration of Na+? It is 1s2, 2s2, 2p6 and 3s0. There is no electron in 3s orbital when I am dealing with any salt of sodium. Say for example, if I am dealing with sodium chloride, it is Na+. There is no electron in 3s orbital, and in mechanism I am showing that there is an electron in the 3s orbital, which is not so, at least in a compound form. Then from where this electron has arrived? From where this electron have come? We get this electron have came from flame. Because flame have very high temperature, many of the electrons are formed in this reaction, and out of many of the electrons, one of the electron is picked up by the 3s orbital of sodium ion, which gets excited, and when comes back, emits a photon of golden yellow color, consequently giving a typical color to the flame. Another question that remained to be answered is why we are making a paste of our mixture with the concentrated HCl to get a flame test. So what is the role of concentrated HCl in this? Why concentrated HCl? Why we are not taking a mixture and directly a drop of water, making a paste of it, taking it on a platinum loop, and then heating an oxidizing flame of a Bunsen burner? Why are we not using water instead? This is because if we want to see the flame color more effectively, the flame color must be spread out in the whole space of the flame. If it is concentrated in a smaller zone of the flame, it may be difficult or it may not be possible for one to identify the color that is imparted to the flame by the sample. So we want the flame to be we want a color to be seen in the whole flame. This is possible only and only if the metal cation that is sensitive to flame test spreads out, occupies almost the whole space of the flame. This is possible only and only if metal is allowed to go in a gaseous state. But because we are dealing with a semi-micro mixture which are metal salts, and because metal salts are ionic, they have very high melting and boiling point. So they have high melting point and high boiling points. So it is difficult to convert these metal salts into gas. And if these metals do not convert into gas, then they won't impart a color to the flame in the whole space of the flame, but will be imparting color in a small space, which may not be possible to observe. So what we do is we combine a mixture with concentrated HCl, and our mixture is a mixture of two metal salts. Metal combines with the chloride of HCl to form metal chlorides, and generally metal chlorides are volatile to heat. So as soon as it gets converted into metal chloride, when you supply heat to the sample, salt sample now, which is in a metal chloride form, immediately it goes into gaseous state, allowing that salt metal cation to occupy almost the whole space of the flame and giving beautiful color to the whole flame, making observations of the color to the flame more effective. So the role of adding HCl is to convert our cation into metal chlorides, which are more volatile, making our flame test more effective. Now, why metal chlorides are volatile? You may get the answer in Pajan's rule. I would direct to see any of the reference book to know what is Pajan's rule. You will get to know why metal chlorides are volatile if you read Pajan's rule. Now let us see another dry test, which is borax speed test. In borax speed test, what do we do is a hot platinum loop is dipped in borax powder. So hot platinum loop is dipped in a borax powder, and the borax that is stuck to the loop is heated in an oxidizing flame. What happens here? Borax melt and then forms a transparent glass bead. So we must ensure that the borax melts, and after that when it cools it forms a transparent glass bead. This transparent glass bead is then touched to the mixture. So hot bead then touched to the mixture, that is our sample, and again heated in a oxidizing flame. And after that what we are going to observe is, we are going to observe color of the bead. What we do is, first of all we heat it in an oxidizing flame, observe a color in two conditions, hot and cold. Once we do this, then we heat it in a reducing flame, and again we observe a color under two conditions, hot and cold. So we are doing it in oxidizing flame as well as in a reducing flame, and observing in both the cases for color in hot and cold conditions. So we are observing for color in oxidizing flame and reducing flame at two different conditions, hot and cold. And with that we may come with some inference. If the color is green when hot and turns blue when cold in oxidizing flame, whereas if it is colorless when hot and turns red when cold, our inference is copper may be present. If the color is yellowish brown, or red when hot in oxidizing flame and turns yellow when cold, whereas if the color is green in reducing flame when hot and remains green in reducing flame when cold, we say the metal is iron. Our inference is Fe may be present. If the color is dark yellow in oxidizing flame when hot and turns green when cold, whereas in reducing flame it is green in hot as well as in cold condition, we say the metal we are dealing with is chromium. Our inference is chromium may be present. If in oxidizing flame in hot condition, if the color is violet and remains violet even on cooling, whereas in reducing flame it remains colorless in both the conditions, When we say the metal we are dealing with, our inferences, manganese may be present. Manganese may be present. If the color in hot condition in oxidizing flame is blue and remains blue even in cold condition, similarly, even in reducing flame, if it remains blue in hot as well as in cold condition, we say cobalt is present. If the color in hot condition in oxidizing flame is reddish brown, and remains reddish brown on cooling, whereas in reducing flame, when it is hot, it is either gray or black and turns opaque on cooling, we say our inference is nickel may be present. Nickel may be present. Now let us understand some chemistry behind borax speed test. What are we doing is, we are taking a borax powder and heating it in oxidizing flame on a platinum loop. At the very first step, it loses all the water of crystallization and forms a fluffy mass, anhydrous borax. So this is a fluffy mass, and because we are heating it continuously, our heating is continued further, it suffers a chemical conversion and forms boric oxide and sodium metaborate So this is boric oxide, also called as anhydrous boric acid, and forms sodium metaborate. So this results in the formation of a glass bead. So the glassy bead that we are getting is this. Then what we are doing is, we are making this glassy bead to come in contact with our mixture. So mixture is made to come in contact with a glassy bead, and then it is heated first in an oxidizing flame, observed for color at two conditions, hot and cold. And then in reducing flame, and again observed for color at two different conditions, hot and cold. Okay, so we'll try to see how this glassy bead reacts with our mixture to give different colors in oxidizing flame when it is hot and cold, and also in reducing flame to give different colors in hot and cold conditions. Glassy bead reacts with the metal cation that is present in the sample. First of all, we'll see what is the chemistry involved in oxidizing flame. We know that oxidizing flame have high temperature and can also carry out oxidizing reaction. So oxidizing flame of high temperature, and it can allow oxidizing reaction to occur. Okay, so any metal salt when heated in an oxidizing flame on a glassy bead first gets oxidized to its respective metal oxide. Say if we are dealing with the salt of copper carbonate, on heating in an oxidizing flame, it will convert into copper oxide and it will lose carbon dioxide gas, so it will result in the formation of oxide of its respective metal. Here it is copper oxide. If we are dealing with copper nitrate, on heating it will form copper oxide, nitrogen dioxide and oxygen gas and oxygen. So it will result in the formation of copper oxide again. So in oxidizing flame, our metal salts will, when heated strongly at high temperature, will get oxidized to their corresponding metal oxides. These metal oxides then react with the boric oxide that is present in the glassy bead and gets converted into metaborates of metal, corresponding metal, giving a typical color. So it results in the formation of metaborate salt of corresponding metal. These salts give different colors at hot and cold condition. Any material which changes its color with respect to temperature, we call this phenomenon as thermochromism. Therm means heat and chrome means color. So any material which can change its color by change in temperature, we call the process as thermochromism. It is one of the area of spectroscopy to be studied, and you can understand what is thermochromism if you refer any good physical chemistry textbook. So it results in the formation of metal metaborate salts which give typical color, and many times these colors are thermochromic, so give different color in hot and cold condition. What is the reactions involved in reducing flame? So now reducing flame. We know that in reducing flame, because we have carbon particles, elemental carbon, it acts as a reducing agent. And what is responsible for the reducing nature of reducing flame? It is carbon particles in a flame. So carbon is acting as a reducing agent. In a reducing flame. So how the reaction happens is, the sodium metaborate salt that is present in our glass bead reacts with our metal borate Say now if again I take an example of copper, then if we are dealing with copper, then we'll get a metaborate of copper whose formula will be this. We are only replacing M by copper because we are taking an example of copper now. So copper metaborate salt, and now we have carbon. And what is the source of this carbon? Flame. And what is the role of this carbon? It is acting as a reducing agent, and we are heating it in a reducing flame. It forms borax, elemental copper, and loses carbon dioxide. So it is forming metallic copper which is red in color. So we see red scales in a glass bead. So we need to balance this reaction. So the reaction is balanced. So sodium metaborate will react with the metal metaborate salt in presence of carbon. So the metal will reduce into its lower oxidation state or in a metallic form by forming borax. Now point is to be noted that borax is getting formed in the reducing flame, whereas what we have observed is that in oxidizing flame we have performed this we have got this glass bead in oxidizing flame. So this was in oxidizing flame. In oxidizing flame, borax was unstable. It got converted into boric acid and metaborate. But now, to our surprise, in reducing flame, borax is getting formed. So borax is stable in reducing flame but unstable in oxidizing flame. So it got converted into boric oxide and sodium metaborate. Why this is so? Why borax is stable in reducing flame? Because reducing flame have low temperature. So it is the low temperature of the reducing flame that allows the formation of a borax. Now let us see the another test which is similar to borax bead test. It is microcosmic salt bead test. Microcosmic salt is ammonium, sodium, hydrogen, phosphate. So it is ammonium, sodium, hydrogen, phosphate salt. Test is similar to that of borax bead test. What do we do is we make a loop of platinum wire, take a cosmic salt on it, and then we heat in an oxidizing flame. To get a glassy bead. Following is the reaction involved on heating. Microcosmic salt is a dihydrate salt. So on heating in oxidizing flame, it loses all the water of crystallization and it converts into another chemical form. It loses ammonia, 5 water molecules, and gets converted into sodium metaphosphate. So this is sodium metaphosphate. This is the key ingredient which is going to help us to perform qualitative analysis. So this is present in a glassy bead. This bead is then made this bead is then allowed to come in contact with copper sulfate, and again heated in an oxidizing flame. Following reactions occur. Copper sulfate in an oxidizing flame gets converted into copper oxide. This copper oxide then reacts with sodium metaphosphate. This is from a bead. In an oxidizing flame, then gets converted into sodium copper orthophosphate. Which is blue in color. So the bead turns into blue bead. So blue bead is this. The blue bead that is formed on a platinum loop is made to come in contact with our sample mixture. And again the loop is heated in an oxidizing flame. And observed for following. So we'll look for color of flame, which will help us to come with some inference. If the color of the flame is blue around the bead, it suggests that chloride is present in our sample. If the color of the flame is blue around the bead, and green on top, it suggests that a sample contains bromide ion. And if the color of the flame is green on entire flame, our inference is iodide is present. So iodide may be present in our sample. What is the chemical reaction involved in this? we know that our blue bead is sodium copper phosphate, which if it comes in contact with any of the halide from our sample, say if our halide is sodium halide, on heating it in oxidizing flame, it gets converted into sodium phosphate and copper halide. Copper halides being volatile will go off in the gas and will impart a typical color to the flame. So this is the balanced reaction, and being copper halide being volatile will impart a typical color. If it is chloride, will give blue color around the bead. If it is bromide, will give blue color around the bead, and top it will be green. If the color is green entire, then we say iodide is present. Again, here is to be seen that because copper iodide is the most volatile salt in copper halides, this copper iodide will evaporate most beautifully and will envelop the whole flame. Consequently, the entire flame will look beautifully greenish flame.